Thank you. Thank you. Hello, everyone. We are going to get started. I do see some empty seats, so if you don't have a seat, please grab a seat. Make yourself comfortable. Is this anyone's first time coming to the People's Forum? Raise your hand if this is. Oh, we got a lot of new faces. Well, welcome to the space. I hope to see you again soon. The People's Forum is a home for the people. This is a hub for working class movements to build. We host all kinds of events, amazing book talks like these. There's a film screening downstairs. We uplift working class culture, art, and film. You can check out all of our amazing programming on our website. And I will pass it to Peter.
Thank you very much. My name is Peter Bratz, and I'd like to welcome everyone on behalf of Eris Press. There are books for sale, as you can see. The signed copies are the same price, Alex, or they're discounted? Same price? So you can pick up a copy at your leisure. Yeah, that's our mission, to destroy commodity fetishism. Obviously, joining us today are the authors of No Politics, Professor Adolph Reed from the University of Pennsylvania, Professor Walter Benn Michaels from the University of Illinois at Chicago, and Barbara Fields, who is the William R. Shepard, is that correct? I'm remembering. Professor of History at Columbia University, and the author of, among other works, Racecraft, The Soul of Inequality in America. So we'll have a discussion about the book until at most 8 o'clock. And then we're going to open it up for questions and discussion to the audience. Thank you very much. When you speak, you have to speak into the microphone.
I guess yes, it's definitely on, but I can hear it.
I think you're on.
So I'm going to start off with just a few comments. And I think the way I'd like to kick off the discussion, and this sort of gets into the spirit of the book more than its specific content. It is a couple of weeks ago, as at least 3 people in the audience know, Walter and I did an event at Johns Hopkins, which was quite informative and interesting and lively. And when I got home, in reflecting on it, what would occur to me, and Walter and I had prepped a little bit like ahead of time, but we didn't think consciously that our prepping was going to be anchored by focus on very concrete and material social relations, and as part of trying to make sense out of how capitalism and various ideologies, there I said capitalism, I trust everybody's okay, but various ideologies of ascriptive hierarchy, as I sometimes describe them, work in a relation to one another, and quite independently of each other. Each of our prepared remarks focus on very concrete instances to try to make the real contradictions clear. And after the fact, in reflecting after the event, I realized that most of the questions or the challenges that came at us in the Q&A, they weren't hostile, by and large, but were sort of bypassed all of the concrete points that we made and patterns of social relations that we described, and sort of ratcheted up the scale of abstraction to that plane where nameless, faceless, bodiless ideas do combat right across the eons. And I just, and in fact, before I forget, I hope I have it, my son, who, to keep the nepotism rolling, was what was Professor Fields' TA many years ago, sent me last night a link to a panel that she was on, this was a year ago, right, with what another race and ideology event. I don't seem to have the sheet with the title of it on me, but it's one I urge everyone to watch, because it's one of the clearest expositions of what race is and isn't that I've ever seen. And you could probably find it by typing in her name and her other panelist, a fellow named Derek, D-E-R-I-K, Smith, who's a poetry professor at Claremont. All right, but it was the same phenomenon there, right? She was talking very concrete history, and he was talking like in that level of the exosphere where Afro-pessimism and socialism and anti-colonialism and revolution, right, all just blur together. And I've been thinking about that ever since our Hopkins, when you know it, excuse me. Yes, exactly, but you haven't seen the funny part yet. Right. And, I mean, lo and behold, that was my son.
He knows you're doing this. It's right.
Yes, he's trying to fuck with me. Which wouldn't be the first time that's happened. But anyway, but I've been turning this phenomenon over in my mind, because this is supposed to be the sort of debate or discussion that we have about politics, right? I mean, the title of the book kind of says it. Punto fin nada más, right? There's no politics but class politics. Anything that pretends to be other than a class politics is a class politics that's trying to hide its roots and intentions, which then leads me to this other question that I came up with like in the early hours of yesterday morning, not really thinking about this event, but about the state of the world in general, but it prompts like an opening question for our discussion, which is, why is it that as we sit here where we are at this moment in America, with the when we can practically hear the whinnying of the horses in the fascist barracks, are we having debates about which is more important, race or class, or stuff like that? And I think that one answer is that the worlds in which most of us, and I don't mean us in this room, but those of us who identify with what I've taken to referring to as the phenomenon that occupies the cultural space that a left would occupy in the US if there were one, and in the academy, to whatever extent there's a difference, don't seem to be as concerned about this, the implications of what I perceive to be we all perceive to be a very real danger of an authoritarian, more than creep, takeover, constitutional coup, like whatever you want to call it, lawfare. And I think the answer is that the fundamental commitment to political or to politics, or to what people in that world tend to understand as politics, doesn't really have anything to do with pursuit of power or political transformation, because the left in the U.S. had by and large gave up on being motivated by an ideal of broad social transformation in this country before most of the people in this room were born. And I'm going to stop for now by saying that I think that I've done, that I've captured at least one angle on what it is that prompted us to do this book in the first place, and what our punchline and warrants are. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks, Adolph. I'm going to, I mean, everything he said was obviously right from my perspective, and we will talk about specifics. I thought it'd just be useful, though, for I mean, in an ideal world, all of you already read the book a million times and whatever, but to give a sense of how this works in the book, since we don't live, well, not the least ideal thing about our world is that you haven't read the book. There are even bigger problems. But to give it a sense of just how the book works in relation to that. And I think do it pretty quickly.
Could you turn your mic off? If you're not speaking, please turn your mic off. If you're not speaking, turn your mic off. How do you turn it off?
Yeah, how do you turn it off?
It's right here. So I'm on, right?
Yeah.
So when Adolph and I first started working together, it was maybe like 20 years ago. And the first thing I think we sort of agreed on two things. We agreed, importantly, on the idea there was no such thing as race. That is to say that there's no biological entity called race, and if there is no biological entity called race, race is not a social construction. There's actually an essay in the book called Why Race is Not a Social Construction. As we both found ourselves, we'd been saying independently, like, you know, when people discovered there weren't unicorns, no one started speaking about the social construction of the unicorn. That you want to think about what the ideological work race does, not about, like, ways to keep it going. The other thing that we agreed on was what we then thought of, and there's an essay by Adolph in the book called this, The Limits of Anti-Racism. And the idea basically was that the limits of anti-racism was obviously a good thing, but there were certain things it couldn't do. And in a certain sense, what the last 20 years have sort of radicalized the idea of certain things that anti-racism couldn't do. And where this connects up with sort of the question of the concrete and the abstract would be, obviously in the kind of abstract case, anyone's going to think, yeah, anti-racism and anti-capitalism are completely compatible. There's no logical contradiction between them. So that the standard response, where we do both, is of course the correct response. And in the abstract, that's completely true. But concretely, it seemed to us over the last 20 years, we've been working together, and in the essays embodied in this book, that became increasingly untrue. That is, that anti-racism actually emerged as not simply one of the several things that we would be committed to as part of an anti-capitalist program, but it's something that actually, in a way, worked for neoliberal capitalism. And you can say quickly in two ways the way that worked. One was that as anti-racism became central, it's really a part of a larger program of anti-discrimination. One wants to say the same thing about anti-discrimination. There is no form of discrimination that should be tolerated. To be a so-called class reductionist is not to argue that somehow, you know, we shouldn't worry about transphobia, that we shouldn't worry about homophobia. It's completely false. We should worry about every form of discrimination. So no form of discrimination is right, it's justified. But when you began to sort of produce discrimination as the model of inequality in our society, and when you did this against the backdrop of a society in which actually the gap between the rich and the poor grew every single year up until the second year of COVID, when it temporarily stopped because of the Biden administration and is now growing again, you began to think differently about what it meant to think about discrimination as the engine of inequality in our society. Which is to say, it became obvious that discrimination is not the engine of inequality. Capitalism itself is the engine of inequality. And that, in fact, if what we were committed to was anti-discrimination, we were committed to neoliberalism's utopian, sort of wet dream of what a just society was. That is, in a neoliberal society, an ideal neoliberal society, their class difference would by no means disappear, but nobody would be relegated to the working classes, the lower classes, on account of discrimination, whether it's by race, creed, color, sexuality, whatever. So that discrimination became increasingly the bête noire of a neoliberal society, and anti-discrimination became actually the central engine of the drive for equality. But of course, anti-discrimination doesn't produce any greater equality. You could produce complete equality between the races, but that wouldn't produce any more equality between classes. The whole idea of class difference is predicated on inequality. So, and you could see, just to sort of get a sense of the concreteness, what would be the perfect form of this neoliberalizing, weaponizing of anti-discrimination would be intersectionality. Why? Because intersectionality precisely in the sense, oh, we take care of race, race matters, class matters, sexuality matters, but they matter in very different ways. And of course, they do all matter. Race and sexuality matter precisely as forms of discrimination. Class is not a form of discrimination, but actually what you began to see, and what you have seen in it for the last 15 years, is the effort to turn class into an identity on the model of race and sex, and to treat the problem of being born into the working class as if it were an obstacle to be overcome. So, but there is no left program that says what we want to do is help people get out of the working class. The left program is actually on behalf of the working class, not on behalf of escaping the working class. So when you live in a world in which people tell you the most advanced thought about inequality today is intersectionality, you live in a world in which a left critique has turned into actually the kind of HR justification of the inequalities that we in fact live with and operate with. So, you know, part of the depressing part of being on the left from this standpoint is being told that, no, the real sort of progressivism is, and I just single out intersectionality because, you know, it's like, especially if you're a professor, if you're an English professor, it's just like part of like built into the structure of your life. And it's certainly right that no one should be discriminated against in the workplace or anywhere else, but it's certainly not right that the problem of being born working class is that people discriminate against you on account of the fact that you're working class, and that therefore don't give you a fair chance to stop being working class. That obviously is not a left program. So the other way of thinking about this was that not only do we get discrimination as the kind of central engine of justice, or anti-discrimination as the central engine of justice, but we also got a kind of commitment to race itself, that is, socially constructed but still with us. If you listen to Barbara's thing, I've only listened to part of it, but Adolph recommended. She's talking to someone who's deeply, deeply committed to the idea that race has got to keep on going. And of course, racecraft is deeply opposed to that, and we've been deeply opposed to that forever on. So what's wrong with the idea of hanging on to any form of race? You can do it pretty fast. The people who really loved race in America, say post-Civil War, were basically white supremacists. If any of you, so I'm a literary historian that is involved at a certain moment in my life reading a lot of Thomas Dixon. Thomas Dixon was the great racist writer of the turn of the century. The famous movie, Birth of a Nation, is based on his Klan trilogy. There's a moment in Dixon where a black guy is about to be accused, he's totally guilty, it's in the book, of raping and murdering an innocent young white girl. And the townsmen gather together and they give a little speech. The kind of banker gives a little speech. And the speech he gives is like, here we are. You got your bankers, your yeoman farmers, your gentleman farmers, the peddlers, the guy who works for the farmer, the dirt guys, the blacksmith. You got the whole social panoply of this little town in North Carolina. We're all brought together because we see these differences don't matter. What matters is that we are all white people. So one thing that race did right from the start, race took things like class difference and told you that class difference actually wasn't a big deal. The thing that mattered was racial identity. I mean, in effect, what race did for white racists was turn your class enemy into your racial brother. Well, that's good news for rich white people. It's good news for white capitalists, for whose relation to their white workers is supposed to be, but we're all white. So the thing about anti-racism is anti-racism does exactly the same thing. And I just give a last easy example. I mean, just think of affirmative action. You know, lamented, but not that much. I've never been opposed to affirmative action, but always just been struck by its class utility and the general commitment to so-called representation. So what does affirmative action do? Affirmative action guarantees, or tried to guarantee with more or less success, the more elite the institution, the more successful it was. That, in fact, a representative number of people of color, primarily black people, got to go to like Harvard, got to go to Columbia. Where I used to teach, Johns Hopkins and Berkeley, it was also there. Where I teach now, a much less elite university, we don't have a problem getting the right number of minority people at UIC. So what's the basic idea? The basic idea of it is this is good for black people. So how the fuck is it good for black people? I mean, if you imagine a white person now at like, I don't know, Staten Island College. Right. College of Staten Island, thank you. And you imagine this guy, white guy at the College of Staten Island, you know, I'm from Chicago, but originally from New York, but come from Chicago. So you imagine a white guy at the College of Staten Island, and he says to himself, you know, No offense to College of Staten Island, that's the kind of place I have wanted to teach, but College of Staten Island, if you look at the median income of the College of Staten Island, I'll bet you it's fairly low. If you look at the median income of like students at Columbia University, my son too went to Columbia University, it's not low. I haven't looked it up recently, but I'll bet you it's like $175,000, $180,000. So if you're a white kid at Staten Island, you're thinking to yourself, you know, it sucks that I have to go to Staten Island, College of Staten Island. But when I look at all those white students over at Columbia, I feel a lot better about the world because at least there are a lot of white guys at Columbia. So nobody thinks we should think that. But black people are supposed to go, it sucks that I can't even go to the College of Staten Island, unless Staten Island's changed a lot from what it was when I used to live here. When I'm going to Hostas Junior College, that still exists, Hostas Community College. But I feel a whole lot better because there are a bunch of black kids over at Columbia. Why should we imagine that that somehow counts as a blow for the working class? That's precisely the same form of mystification that was at work when Thomas Dixon had his rich white guys telling the white sharecroppers that, yeah, I'm not saying there aren't some differences between us, but the crucial thing is we're all white. And affirmative action was supposed to say to like, yeah, the kids are going to Harvard and Columbia, not saying there aren't some differences between them and like the kids who are going to Hostas and the kids who aren't going anywhere, but the crucial thing is that we're all black and therefore those of us who are black at Harvard really stand in for you, right? So the point about that is it once again turned the class enemy into the racial brother or sister. So the point for us was that, you know, as you looked at this, it wasn't really that one could say about anti-racism that it was just like an intrinsic good, which it is. And anti-discrimination was just an intrinsic good, which it is. But it was an intrinsic good which is weaponized for a society committed to anti-discrimination, committed to meritocracy, committed to a whole set of forms, obviously not always successfully, but taking it at its highest ambitions, committed to a whole set of things which, if they succeeded, would completely leave a class society intact, except for the fact that you would now have a justification for it since, no, black kids now can get into Harvard, so if you're stuck at Hostas, it's on you, dude. It's not on anybody else, it's yours. So from that standpoint, you know, a part of the point of the book is that it's completely easy to see that affirmative action was part of the class politics, and the class politics was the class politics of the ruling class. That doesn't mean, of course, that the attempt to undo it comes from the revolutionary left. On the contrary, it comes from guys who are even worse than the guys who are doing it. But one of the ways you see that we got to the position we're in is that we've been fighting all along from the really, really bad guys who actually would go back and read Thomas Dixon and think, yeah, the white supremacist stuff sort of works for me. And the good guys who would go back and read Thomas Dixon and say, the guy got it wrong. It's anti-racism that does the work. We want the link between black people at all levels to be visible, not the link between white people at all levels. But both of them subscribe, in effect, to two different versions, one more toxic than the other, but neither one of them any good from the standpoint of the left, of a society for which the idea of race and the various ideological apparatuses that race has made available to us in the last 150 years is absolutely central. So the point of the book, you know, is that we shouldn't do that anymore, and that the left should, from this standpoint, not be committed to the idea that race is at the center of the left politics, and being committed to the idea that you can only begin to understand the workings of race if you get what's got to be true from a certain perspective, but although obviously a contestable one, which is that no, class difference and class struggle is essentially at the heart of American neoliberalism. So now you're on. And then what we're going to do is you'll talk, and then we'll all talk a little bit. But after Barbara's done, I think people should, so I've never had a chance to do this with Barbara. I should say now, I want to say one thing. Somehow I've managed to be teaching in this world for 50 years. I've known who Barbara was since I was like, you know, young.
Say hi to a puppy.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a pleasure for me to get to talk to you all. I always like hanging out with Adolph, but this is actually the first time I've ever met Barbara Fields. So the big event for me tonight was meeting Barbara Fields. And you're going to get to talk, and then after she talks, we'll talk a bit, but we've done this a lot. People usually have a lot to say. And the minute Barbara stops talking, anybody who wants to raise a hand and open their mouth should feel free to do so.
first instruction I got from the organizers was that I should discuss and seek Adolph and Walter's response to the main criticisms that the book has attracted or that you expect the book to attract. Now, the marching orders, now what? The marching orders have undergone a series of amendments since that time, and the truth is, I've only seen one critical evaluation. I'm sure you've all been, the two of you have been following them closely. But because of the nature of the one that I saw, there's still feedback. Why? Do I have to really hold it up into my tonsils? Actually, I don't have any tonsils.
Me neither. So we're all black and white, unite and fight, no tonsils.
But because of the nature of that one critical evaluation that I saw,
Barbara, use mine. Use mine, see if it works better.
Oh, it wasn't off. Now we're good. Now we should be good.
okay. Because of the nature of that one critical evaluation that I did see, I thought I'd begin there. Because the critics in question, I'm not going to name them, discovered mystery or double meaning or both or something in the title, No Politics But Class Politics. And from there inquired into the meaning of the words politics and class, and discussed at some length whom they suppose the authors include in the term working class. And then there's an argument about who does and who doesn't, and whether they are behind the times in who they include, and so forth. To me, there was no mystery about the title, and no need to probe definitions and memberships. What came to my mind as I read the essays in the book, most of them familiar to me, though not all, and the interviews, which were all new to me. What came to my mind was a book by a distinguished moral philosopher who died in July, one of only 2 books about moral philosophy that I know about that became bestsellers. And most of the people in this audience are no doubt familiar with the book On Bullshit by Harry G. Frankfurt. Because it seemed to me that on Adolph's and Walter's analysis, the politics that seems to have ousted class politics among so many persons who consider themselves to be on the left fits neatly into Harry Frankfurt's highly technical and philosophically precise definition of bullshit. Professor Franklin carefully distinguished between lies and bullshit, to the moral advantage, it has to be said, of lies. Telling a lie, he says, quote, is an act with a sharp focus. It is designed to inset a particular falsehood at a specific point occupied by the truth. And doing so, quote, requires a degree of craftsmanship in which the teller of the lie submits to the objective constraints imposed by what he takes to be the truth. The liar, therefore, according to Frankfurt, quote, is inescapably concerned with truth values. In order to invent a lie at all, he must think he knows what is true. And in order to invent an effective lie, he must design his falsehood under the guidance of that truth. Now, by contrast, according to Frankfurt, a person who undertakes to bullshit his way through has much more freedom. His focus is panoramic rather than particular. He does not limit himself to inserting a certain falsehood at a specific point, and thus he is not constrained by the truth surrounding that point or intersecting it. He is prepared, so far as required, to fake the context as well. What bullshit, I'm skipping a little bit, what bullshit essentially misrepresents, according to Frankfurt, is neither the state of affairs to which it refers, nor the beliefs of the speaker concerning that state of affairs. Those are what lies misrepresent by virtue of being false. Since bullshit need not be false, it differs from lies in its misrepresentational intent. The bullshitter may not deceive us or even intend to do so, either about the facts or about what he takes the facts to be. What he does necessarily attempt to deceive us about is his enterprise. His only indispensably distinctive characteristic is that in a certain way he misrepresents what he is up to. And why that appealed to me is that it seems to me that that's essentially what Walter and Adolph have shown about the politics of racial disparity and racial this, that, and the other. What they are up to is what they conceal. And that I took, the critics that I spoke about seemed to find a mystery there, but that's what I took to be the point of the title, No Politics But Class Politics. Because any other is the bullshit that is misrepresenting what it's up to. And that's why I appreciated the essays and the book. I've always appreciated Walter's and Adolph's commentary. And especially because, and I see this in my own classroom, the way race as a word, as a term, as something to throw around, floats in the ether that the students occupy. And it's very hard to get them to reflect on why that is, or even on why, as I remarked in an introduction to a foreword to Adolph's book, the term white supremacy now is heard chiefly among so-called progressives. They're the ones who use it. My students know that if they write the word race in a paper that they hand to me, they will get a squiggly line in my 0.3 millimeter pencil with a marginal demand that they explain what they think they mean by race. I avoid the word in my teaching, except in the annual Invention of Race lecture that I give early on in the class, during which the students learn why I avoid the word, except when I'm quoting a source that uses it or explaining what's wrong with the notion. And I can tell you that my sister and co-author Karen and I spent several hours when we were in the final stages of racecraft, spent several hours going through the work of the excellent indexer whom Verso had hired for the purpose, so that we could replace nearly every entry for race or racial with a term that referred to something real. Nearly all, not all. We kept, among others, for example, the expression race, racism, evasion, which we wanted readers to be able to find, race-blood equation, and folk-race categories. But other instances, we found a way to turn those, first of all, into something concrete, but second of all, into a way to close the trapdoors that allow readers and students to keep coming back to the notion of race. Because it's like a railroad switch. If you don't set it correctly, then the train goes off onto a siding, or maybe it collides with another train, which is what the Race Disparity Express keeps doing. It's colliding with the real politics, with the politics that we need. So, for example, in place of intra-racial distinctions, which our indexer suggested to refer to an episode involving my grandmother, who taught at a segregated school. This was back in the 1920s, probably, in Charleston County. And the superintendent who was in charge of the school warned her that the poor white people in the county would resent anything that looked as though the colored school was getting something that they didn't have. So he was warning her, in effect, don't do anything too fancy at that school. So the indexer had put intra-racial distinctions, and we changed that to black-white versus white-white distinctions. I think, and I have something to my students, I'm something of a crank on the subject, but I really want them, they will leave my class and all they'll know is, Professor Fields has a thing about this, but at least they will have, at least for a time, the impression every time they use the word or tempted to use it or see it used, they'll remember, oh yeah, Professor Fields said something about that. And that's sometimes that's as much as you can hope for. When the students ask me, well, what are we supposed to say? And I keep asking them what are you talking about? And what it ends up being is ancestry. So I've suggested to them that that's what you want. The trouble is, race carries with it, bound up with it in that blanket of misunderstanding. It carries racism with it. And I'm always trying to get my students to distinguish between race, which is a fiction, and racism, which is a crime against humanity. Racism is an action. It is not a state of mind. It's not bigotry or prejudice. It is an action. And so I'm trying to get the students to recognize that distinction. And so I tell them ancestry. Well, for the students, let them wrestle for that for a while. But for the adults, like the people in this room, what ancestry accomplishes, that's for the people who know. Here's a comedian who had a sequence in one of his routines where he was nostalgic about a time, he said, when there were two kinds of people. There were the people who knew shit and the people who didn't know shit. And he said, back then, the people who didn't know shit knew that they didn't know shit. And so they hung back. When people who knew shit were talking, they hung back. Oh, you not talking? No, I don't know shit. But I want to learn some shit. I can't do it the way Alonzo Bodden does it, but it's great. Well, for the people who know some shit, as soon as you say ancestry instead of race, I can't do this and talk into the microphone. You're one person. You have two parents. Then you have 4 grandparents. You have 8 great-grandparents. And it keeps on going geometrically until there are billions of your ascendants, right? And some years ago, an author had an article, I think it was in Harper's, in which he talked about the meaning of those large numbers as he came to learn about it. When he was sub-teen, he got fascinated by genealogy. And his mother sent him to talk to his aunt, whoever it was, Aunt Fanny. And she had him casting family trees and looking through to see who was related to whom in this way. And one day she said, she pointed to something on the family tree and she said, look, that shows that we are descended from Charlemagne. And he was really chuffed about that. You know, my family are descended from Charlemagne. He was a sub-teen. Then he got to college and he took a statistics class. And one day the professor was talking about very large numbers and used an individual's ascendants as an example. And he said, this is such a large number that any one of you has so many ascendants that there were never that many people occupying the earth, let alone the ascendants of everybody else. So what you know is that there has to be a lot of overlap. And what that means is everybody here is probably descended from Charlemagne. All the air went out of the person's balloon. But as soon as you understand that, as soon as you know shit, when you hear the term ancestry, you are aware of all those billions of people. And that really precludes you from using that as a substitute for race. And that's why I try to encourage my students, if that's what you're talking about, talk about that. And if you want a kind of ancestry that is particular, you know, you don't just want ancestry, you want the kind that's stigmatized. Why don't you just say that? Anyway, I think I've said enough. I'm going to let the audience talk for a while.
So maybe I'd comment that. I just say one thing is that just doing that, so I don't know, as a weakness, it's like watching porn. I watch Skip Gates' Ancestry show periodically. And yeah, everybody is in search of stigmatized ancestry. The whole point of that show is to find someone, wait, there's got to be a slave back, did at least someone die in the Holocaust? I mean, there's got to be something like that to work. And yeah, it's actually a perfect version of that.
This will work is I'll come with the microphone and you speak into the microphone if you want to ask a question, and then people.
Hello, my name is Daniel, and I come here representing certain ideology, outlook, worldview, Afrofuturism. I am rooted in a critical race theory that is a big part of the way I see the world. And one big thing about Marxism in general is the white supremacist undertones of Marx himself and his ideology. You can see numerous times where it's documented where he says many racist remarks, and also just a critique of historical materialism where he centers European industrial production as the model of progress and evolution throughout time, negating Native American and indigenous cultural systems. So it's not just about biology. Human beings are comprised of biocultural evolution. We biologically evolve also culturally. And as a matter of fact, there's certain cognitive cultural complexes that are in Africa and that developed in the indigenous spaces and also in Europe. And the present state of capitalism is built upon the cognitive structures that developed out of Europe. And historical materialism within itself is an expression of white supremacy because Karl Marx says that the Asiatic societies and the African societies were static and weren't legitimate societies, and the Europeans alone were to colonize those areas and put them on the course to industrialism. That is a part of his whole stance. Also, the labor movement in America historically has unions have all racially segregated and discriminated against African Americans historically. So without that, how do you address those issues of decolonizing the economic systems and and also the role that poor white people have played in the subjugation, in the extraction, in the global capitalist order. The biggest race riot in America was here in New York by mobs of poor whites against black people. So I think that in terms of holding the system accountable, and also the constituent parts of the system, that white America is not just the elite whites. You can see that the lower class whites and the higher class whites have a racial solidarity. So for you to, in many ways, the Black Wall Street, it was poor whites and rich whites who got together and destroyed that town. So white supremacy, I think that just like you say that I'm pandering into the left, I think you're pandering into the white race color blindness, of the right, who never addresses racial inequality. And also race, if you look historically, the civil rights era was something that benefited poor people as well, but it was off the framing of race. So my question is how you as a white man in your armchair academia, and you as black people, say that we should not consider race when it's, one, inherently a part of the system, and which in Africa and the global South, who are racially darker, have been disproportionately abused and affected by the system. So for you to negate race is for you to legitimize the system that exists, and you can never dismantle it. So how do you, as a white person, respond to the white supremacist underpinnings of Karl Marx and the disproportionate abuse of the global South as opposed to the North, even the poorest people of the North?
Well, I can't respond as a white person, but whatever. But in my,
speaking of working class, you as a black,
well, can I respond, brother?
you as a specifically, you as a black middle class person, how do you say what's best for black working class people?
Man, you don't have to be the person to sort of state what you think is best for the world.
Right.
That's kind of bullshit.
Champagne socialist, yeah.
Yeah, well, whatever, right? But in my all too brief beginning remarks, but I pointed out that we had this experience at Johns Hopkins where we talked concrete, and people who wanted to challenge us were talking very abstract. So, let me make a couple of concrete observations about contemporary America, right? Let's go from there. First of all, probably everybody, if you think back, right, to 2020 and the summer of George Floyd, right, and all of the stuff that we heard, right, people projecting from what were basically the Potemkin documentary sets of the demonstrations right around the country, that we were on the threshold, right, of a moment, right, of resurgent black militant political activity, however it was described, that the country hadn't seen since the 1960s, right? So that was the summer of 2020, right? And here we are just past the summer of 2023, and somehow, without anyone noticing, all of the energy or chatter, right, about the summer of George Floyd portending like a radical politics has melted down to two issues. Reparations, which is not going to happen, and challenging the racial wealth gap. Now, we've both pointed out, following from Matt Bruenig from the People's Policy Institute, that 75% of so-called black wealth, and I'm going to say something about that in a second, is owned by the richest 10% of black people. And roughly 75% of so-called white wealth is owned by the richest 10% of white people. The bottom 50% of blacks and whites have exactly the same amount of wealth, zero, right? So closing the racial wealth gap and especially closing the racial wealth gap when presented as a response to more broad-scale racial or more broad-scale inequalities that appear as racial disparities, is a class program. It's not a racial program. It's a class program dressed up as a racial program, because the beneficiaries of closing the racial wealth gap will be rich black people or rich women, right, for, I mean, the gender wealth gap. But beyond that, right, I want to say something about the notions of racial wealth, right? Like I did a podcast a couple of years ago with a nationalist brother who acknowledged that there's no such thing as racial wealth that's owned by all black people or white people. But he asked why I didn't pay attention to the category of collective racial wealth. And that's because I don't pay attention to that for the same reason I don't pay attention to unicorns, right? Because there is no such thing as collective racial wealth. For instance, but I know that all of us now, for most of my lifetime, have become so accustomed to thinking about black people, both in the United States and elsewhere, as a subject or the first person subject of a verb, right? Black people want X, the Negro thinks this. African Americans favor, I don't know, Don Cornelius and Democrats. So that no one even thinks to problematize a notion like black wealth. So to try to bring the point home, what I'm going to jump the fence, as what Warren G. Harding said one of his ancestors may have done, and consider the category white wealth, right? And I suggest a thought experiment. So take a white registered nurse who gets laid off and is in danger of losing her house or being evicted from her apartment, right? Is there a pot of collective white wealth that she can appeal to, right? Can she, send a text to Elon Musk and say, hey, like, can you send me a teacup of our collective white wealth so that I don't get evicted? No, because there's no such thing. And by the same token, by the exact same token, there's no such thing as collective black wealth, right? I mean, these are abstractions that get in the way of our understanding of concrete social relations. And I don't know how many other professors there are in the room, but my son has told me, I've heard this from other colleagues. In fact, Frank said the same thing about grad students at Columbia, that students now, right, undergraduate students, and not just at the Mount Holyoke's of the world, but at middle tier state schools, take umbrage at referring to slaves as workers, right? Because somehow the notion that slaves worked, well, it's like that damn Django movie, right? Like the only role that slaves had in that Django movie was sex work and boxing, right? Like you wouldn't have any idea that there was cotton being grown or picked or anything, right? But so what's happened is that we have been, what's become dominant is ideological dispositions in which culture of one sort or another has displaced political economy as a way of understanding who people are and what social relations are. And Walter's book, Our America, charts when that began to happen and how it began to happen, like in the 20s and 30s. It took off again. It went into hyper-reach in post-war American social science. The post-war American social science that influenced people like Harold Cruz and Maulana Karenga and other black nationalists, right, who sort of were in flight from political economy just as much as post-war sociologists were. So I guess my point is, no, like I didn't give a direct response to the alternative interpretation that you laid out there, partly because I don't accept the interpretation. And one of the reasons I don't accept the interpretation is that it doesn't match up with the facts of everyday life as people live them, right? I mean, most black people, like most other people in this country, want the same fucking thing. They get up, go to work every day, or want to find jobs if they don't have them, or want to get better ones if they don't like the ones they have. And they want, you know, decent lives, right? Well, I mean, a materially secure existence, decent housing, that's dependable. I mean, decommodified public services, they wouldn't necessarily put it that way. And adequate health care, right? Most people in this country work for a living, and that's a common experience that's shared across the board. Yeah, I don't want to get into this stuff about you know, what supposedly happened back in the day, but I will say one thing about the labor movement. Robert, the labor movement in this kind of new left, post-new left pattern has always gotten a bad rap, and that's partly because our discourse has rested more on moral posturing than on political analysis, right? I mean, unions in this country have been no worse on racial issues than any other institution in the society, better than most. They're certainly better than the damn churches, for sure. And in fact, the labor movement now is like disproportionately made up of black and brown people and women, right? Even, like I was on a panel that Professor Fields asked me graciously to be on at the Southern Historical Association a number of years ago, about a decade ago. And my talk on the panel was on precisely racial politics in the defeat of the populist movement. And I made the point that, that we need to understand the reaction against populism as a class program, right? That the populist insurgency was a challenge from working people and farmers, black and white. Right, the Colored Farmers Alliance had 1.25 million members, right, in the 1890s, right, and that was the black wing of the populist movement. It was crushed. It was crushed because planter, merchant, capitalist class power was greater than the workers' power, and it was crushed by force, violence, fraud, the same kind of shit that that the Republican Party is cooking up for us now. And my point was that disfranchisement was imposed on poor whites just as it was on blacks. Fraud, violence, intimidation, lynching were imposed on poor whites as much as they were blacks. But so when the panel is over, but an assistant comes up to me to catechize me from the audience. I assume she was an historian because otherwise why'd she be in this hotel in Little Rock? She's too old to be tricking. But she comes up to catechize me about how the poor and the working class whites in the end determined that they were more committed to being white than they were to pursuing their common interests with blacks. So I said to her, well, yeah, there was that, but there was also all that fraud, murder, violence, intimidation, so forth and so on. To which she said to me, well, yeah, there was that. But the real thing, what was their commitment to white supremacy? Yeah, I have no argument for that because that's an interpretation that depends on a will to believe, and I gave up such will a long, long time ago. But the last thing I want to say about this is the real point I wanted to make, that interpretation, well, about the worldview that you laid out doesn't give us any way to make the lives of actual living black people in this country better, or to try to make them better, right? And that's what's so ironic about this to me.
Well, first of all, he just directed to my world. He just criticized my world.
Well, you laid out your criticism of our worldview, right. So I just want to correct one historical error, because I do specialize in the Civil War era. The riot you mentioned in New York City was not a riot of white people against black. It was an anti-draft riot. And it occurred in phases, the first phase actually being, no, the first phase being an attack against people with money and power in New York. And then it devolved into an attack on black people because they were a soft target. I just thought I'd say that because you presented it as a race riot, which it was not. And yes, and let me just say also that I wrote, along with a former student of mine, I wrote an article about a white woman in Missouri a few years ago who was shot dead by the police. Working class white woman on her way to work in the wee hours. And the police officer said what they so often say, oh, well, I thought she had a gun. And when I told this, recounted this episode to a group of students, one of them said, yeah, but she still had white privilege. I don't have anything else to say once somebody says that, because it is not just bullshit, it is stupid.
What are the policy and political ramifications of the analysis that you guys are sharing tonight? Like, what are the actual steps that should be taken in terms of policy and politics?
So can I give one really quick example in this, and then people can be more. I'm an English teacher, so policy is not like my strong suit. But this would go also to these other questions. So if you think about the difference between a kind of fundamentally racial discriminatory, anti-discriminatory agenda and a kind of left universalist egalitarian agenda. So if you look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics and you look at the largest growing job in the US, it's healthcare aides. Healthcare aides are paid basically, I think the last time I checked, the median salary was like $26,000 a year. You can't live on it. Healthcare aides are overwhelmingly women, although not totally women, and among the women, they are largely women of color. Okay? Not overwhelmingly black women, both equally black women and Latinas. Okay? So here are two ways of thinking about this problem. The anti-discrimination way is thinking about this problem is to say a whole bunch of completely true things, which is why are these women in these very bad jobs? These women are in these bad jobs because of history of discrimination, the way discrimination works, the fact that they've not had the opportunity I mean, this job requires not even a high school degree. But again, remember, it's the fastest growing job. These are the jobs that are growing. It doesn't even require a high school degree. And people are forced into it because they can't really do anything else. So what do you want to say? In a just society, those bad jobs would not be basically forced upon women of color. In a just society, those women of color would have had the opportunities that their supervisors had, not the doctors and the kind of nurse practitioners had, who are not disproportionately women of color, are disproportionately actually white people, to actually get better jobs. And so anti-discrimination says to us, anti-racism says to us, we need to make sure that those women have exactly the same kind of opportunity that actually the people who have succeeded have. But again, it doesn't take a moment's thought to realize that there's nothing progressive in that program at all. That is, you might take a momentary satisfaction in a whole bunch of white men actually having these bad jobs, but it's going to be momentary because, in fact, they're going to be equally, unless you want to say you deserved it, which actually is not a left program. You deserve your poverty, you were insufficiently, you didn't work hard enough, you didn't do well enough in your SATs, whatever the hell it is. So what you want to say is, from the standpoint, for the policy recommendation, that's the policy goal from the standpoint, is not to say it's outrageous that women of color are being forced into these jobs, although it is outrageous, but you don't solve the problem for equality at all. You're not even trying to solve for equality by making sure that there are more white guys in the jobs. What you want to say is that the object of our interest is the jobs. So what should we be interested in? Making sure that everybody has an equal opportunity to escape. And again, I remind you, these are the largest growing jobs. This is not like an abstract problem. If you look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, look at it for the last 20 years, ever since I started looking at it, it's been the same 2 or 3 jobs that are at the top, okay? So the policy thing is to say, we don't have to worry about who gets forced into these jobs. When we start worrying about that, we're worrying about the wrong thing. No one should have these jobs. So if you're going to change that, what do you have to change? You have to change the jobs. So that's why the union thing becomes relevant. That's why enabling unions to fight for these people, that's why socializing medicine and not making these, for-profit, the place I've had the most experience with the for-profit ones. How do they make that profit? They make that profit by paying these people $25,000 a year. So there's a fundamental policy goal right from the start. Are we interested in narrowing the difference between good jobs and bad jobs, in making, like going to elite colleges, less and less relevant to what kind of job you end up having? Or are we interested in making sure that everybody has an equal opportunity to escape the bad jobs, but people are still stuck in the bad jobs? And the truth of it is, the history of how you got stuck in the bad job just doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. All the historical stuff doesn't matter. Why doesn't it matter? Because what socialism is supposed to promise you is that, if you do it in terms of reparations. I live in Chicago. North of Chicago, the suburban town of Evanston has started a kind of a local reparations thing. It's not much, but it's something. It's like $25,000. If you can show that you or an immediate ancestor lived in Evanston during the time when Evanston had absolutely racist housing policies, you can say, okay, then you get $25,000 toward your down payment on your mortgage, okay? So fine, that covers a certain number of people. It doesn't cover people, so what if you're just born poor, right? What if you're like a white guy, or you're a black guy, but your parents didn't live there at the right time, and the reason you don't have any money is because of the Tulsa race riot, or because like your parents' great-grandparents' union got busted, and your grandfather's out of the union. Whatever the causal account you have, you can't get a mortgage. So what's the goal? Is the goal to say, we want to figure out the people who have. Let's oppose that to someone who can't get a mortgage because his great-grandfather was like J.P. Morgan and somehow cut him off, and J.P. Morgan or wasted his money away. All those say the right history gives you a right to get a mortgage. So that's completely historicist. That's completely capitalist. The logic of, if you're the victim of some kind of discrimination, then we're going to do this for you. If you're just poor on your own, fuck you. That's not our problem. So what's the socialist goal? This goes back to the policy thing. The socialist goal is what Adolph called decommodified housing. Decommodified housing, it doesn't matter what the history of your poverty is. It doesn't matter whether you can take the high road of being the victim of racism, your ancestors, or the low road of your great-grandfather was like a drunk who passed away all the money that he inherited from his father. It just does not matter. The goal is that everybody will have access to housing. That's what decommodified housing is. That's the universal part of this. Socialism makes history. Socialism makes the causal account of how you came to be victimized irrelevant. The unions were racist. So what's the solution to that? Make sure the unions can't be racist anymore. Not be carrying on about how, like, all the racism of the unions was like whatever it was. You don't have to deny it. So it's back to the policy question. To me, it's not a local policy question, but it'd be the first thing would be to say, if you're in the town of Evanston and you got enough money so you think you can spend $25,000 apiece on reparations, housing reparations, take that money, triple that money, and start building serious public housing for anybody who needs it. And that's a different policy operation.
Yeah, I'd like to speak to that too, and this is really building on Walter. Walter, in his initial comments, mentioned that when we first started working on this stuff 20 years ago, we were much more liberal, right, with regard to the anti-racist line than we have since become, and I think that's partly because as we've dug in, we've gotten clearer and smarter about stuff. I think it's also partly because as the history has evolved, it's evolved toward our view. So that, I'm going to say
In other words, things have gotten way, way worse. That would be
precisely.
Evolving toward our view.
Right, that's That's precisely correct. And I want to make 2 points about that very fact. One is, 2015, 2016, I think, was a watershed moment in making clear what the trajectory of anti-racist politics in the U.S. has been. From one angle, one could say since the end of World War II. From another angle, one could say since the Voting Rights Act. But so in 2015 and 2016, Bernie Sanders puts on the agenda for national political discussion a kind of soft New Deal plus social democratic added together, divided by two. I let the leftists who kind of parse shit like that parse it for me. I don't really care. But what's the response from black activist politics, from anti-racist activist politics? Black Lives Matter. Anybody remember that? Or the IPO? Were they the IPO yet? But what's become clearer, right, is that what is generally understood to be black politics has increasingly defined itself, and I use the substantivist for a reason, as antagonistic to social democratic politics or, to universalistic policies, right? When Joy-Ann Reid and others began to attack references to the working class as veiled efforts to condone white supremacy, the jig, as one might say, was up, right? Because you can see what the deal was. Because what had happened was black people, and this is what's so fucking frustrating, pardon me, but like this has been a driving motif in what has been broadly understood as black politics, or like any political interpretation that begins with a singular subject of a verb, with that subject being black people. Since the 1890s, since September 18th, 1895, when Booker T. Washington gave the address to the Atlanta Cotton States Exposition, that the objective, and our good friend to whom our book is dedicated, Kenneth Warren, has made this point very powerfully in the lit world in his book called What Was African American Literature. But what this interpretation has been about from the very beginning is shoehorning the totality of the black American population into the narrow stratum or class agenda of what was eventually like a professional and managerial strata. The success of the Voting Rights Act, which led to emergence of a broad stratum of black public officials and political functionaries in both the public and private sector, further consolidated, right? There's no black politics that's not a petty bourgeois politics. And there hasn't been for as long as most people in this room have been alive. And we have to ask, just parenthetically, why it is that all of discussion of black political discourse, and I mean almost all the people who write in the nation except for a small handful, but like everywhere else, like across the whole damn left, demands that we disattend from everything that's happened in American society and happened vis-a-vis black people since 1965, right? When we think about it, now I'm sure everybody, since most people in this room I'm sure are leftists, you've had conversations with anti-racists, maybe like the one in the mirror even. But in those conversations, what we get to is a point where to understand the power that racism has in making stuff happen now, we need to resort to analogy with slavery or the Jim Crow era. So it's like, so the requirement of this political discourse is that we deny that anything has changed since 1950 or 1940. Why? Who benefits from that? What perspectives on the world, what approaches to political strategy does that demand open to us and close for us? And if we want to be serious about politics, and like I've said often enough, you know, there's no left in the United States. There's no such thing as the left in the United States, really. There are leftists, but there's no left that's a political force that's capable of having any impact on the terms of debate in this country at this point. And the proof of that, among other things, is that every 4 years we wind up having this argument about whether to get behind, that year's sucky Democrat or to go follow some Don Quixote someplace. Right.
It's called Cornell West.
Well, I'm not saying that. Yeah, I'm not saying that, but take the point. Yeah.
I just have one small thing to say in response to the question about policy. And I would say that one of the highest priorities, which is not to say that it is likely to be attended to, is to do something about taxation. The reason we have, one of the reasons we have the sort of inequality we have is that we're almost at a medieval level of there being a class of people who are essentially immune to taxation. And a situation where you have people who are multi-billionaires and other people who have nothing is the direct cause of there not being enough housing for people to live in. Because people who have the money can buy up the property and they can do whatever they like with it. That does not include making it available for people to live in. So until we can do something about the system of taxation in this country, we're going to be spinning our wheels.
Yeah, the next question.
Yeah, I want to say too quickly. I agree completely with that. And it points, and this gets us back really to the strategic question. Right, and how do we do it, right? And a wise man once said that the point of politics is to unite the many to defeat the few, right? The right seems to understand that, right? And this is another reason that the approach, or the universalistic approach we're taking, is defensible, warranted. Is the correct approach, right? Because once again, most people, or the biggest bulk of people in this country are joined by the shared experience of having to work for a living and everything that follows from that. I was part of a group to try to organize the Labor Party in the U.S. in the 90s, and the leftists always wanted us to have debates about who was the working class, and our view was, well, the working class, it's anybody who has to work for a living or who understands they have to work for a living. And we've had debates, I've been around debates about how we should think about the professional and managerial class. And that goes on for like a couple of iterations, and then it gets stupid and sectarian. To which my response is, well, it's easy to tell the good ones from the bad ones. The good ones are the ones who gravitate to our program, and the bad ones are the ones who gravitate to the other side's program. That's pretty easy. Practice tends to work it out. And I've also been saying, like, for 30 years or more, in meetings of leftists and the like, and my question has never called forth a real answer. How do we expect to get to the solidarities that we are going to have to go up against a powerful, bloodthirsty ruling class if we have to start out by going around a room to establish everything we don't have in common, right? That just seems like stupid politics to me. But I'll finish in a sec. So I began my opening comments with a reference to the danger of fascist or authoritarian politics. Again, I don't want to get in a fight with anybody over what label we should call it. We know what it is. And I think it's important for us to recognize, right, how the right has been able to build to make the hay they've made. Part of it is they've got resources, money, the Kochs, all the rest of that. They control the judiciary, right, and have a large ideological apparatus. But it's also the case that they have followed up or taken advantage with the bullshit siren song of 40 years of Democrats not offering working people anything except bubble gum and hard times, and they're always fresh out of bubble gum. So nothing can happen, right? Like we can, I have friends and others who write really smart position papers and policy papers in think tanks and whatnot, but those don't amount to jack shit without the political power to make it happen. It's the nakedness of bourgeois class power is clearer and more unambiguous at this point in the US and around the world than it has been in my lifetime. And they are what they are. They made very clear what they are. And the only hope that we have is to begin trying to reach out to people who are suffering and frightened in the same ways that we are, to try to build a political force over time that has the capacity to challenge them. And yes, like we absolutely need radical tax reform. And the way for us to get it is to build this broad-based alliance. Sorry.
Hi. So I'm going to preface my question by saying that I have a few specifications at the end. So I guess first, actually, Professor Fields, I'm a Columbia student, and I went to your open lecture last semester or a year ago on the history of race, and that's been something I've been ruminating on since. I'm a history major, a philosophy major, and then I went from ruminating on this very academic question to working in local politics over the summer in a working class neighborhood in Queens, and I found that there was a huge dissonance between this type of thinking in the academy, where it asks for itself and it perpetuates itself, and being able to transmit that to the people that you're talking about, to the working class, with this being a class politics issue. And so I guess the two specifications I would like to add, that my question being, how can we transmit this sort of, the subject of your book to all audiences, not just politically, not just to those in power, but those of the working class? And I guess the specifications are, first, that this is a unique issue insofar as this is disseminated as a book. So like that'll also limit who is able to access that, because that is a very dense form of knowledge that's not easily communicable. And the second issue that the second specification that I have is that with an issue like this, it's a reimagination. It's not simply an interpretive issue. I view this as like, you have interpretation, which is I think something that he touched on, that the first speaker touched on, and you have an interpretive question like that, but you also have a reimaginative discourse that you guys are launching here that exists at a higher realm of discourse beyond interpretation. So how do you juggle with that gargantuan task of having to reimagine interpretation? It's not simply interpretation, it's reimaginative in that sense.
So I wanted to say the first thing that others will answer is that, this being an academic versus working class problem, it's the academy that has been for like my entire lifetime in the academy, which is now, I've just quit, a half a century, which has been really successful in transmitting to everybody the idea that racial identity is like the most important thing about you. Like, in other words, it didn't come welling up from below. It's been what every goddamn, and I know the English department at Columbia, not all of them, but if you take a few English classes, you'll find that people are really able to talk about the primacy of race, indeed in an Afro-pessimist mode, which at least is better than the Afrofuturism, actually is worse than the Afrofuturism that was already on display. So I actually think that if you pose the problem as a problem about how do we get our high-flown ideas into the working class, actually it's posing exactly the wrong way. It turns out we have gotten a lot of high-flown ideas into the working class. We've gotten them to believe in something that doesn't even exist, so they all think they're unicorns. So the second thing then would be is that to rephrase the question, and to rephrase it to say is, how do you remind people of the actual everyday conditions of their lives? And that is not a problem that academics are going to solve. You know, in other words, like none of us has been a super successful organizer. And no offense, dude, I don't think you're likely to be a super successful organizer either. And it has nothing to do with you personally. It has to do with like needing everybody, as it were, not some individual non-white saviors to get out into the world and remind people of what they already know, which is that, you know, it's their jobs that oppress them. And that's the nature of our jobs, is that they are oppressive. So organizing around, you know, going back to the unions, joining a union is a really useful thing. It's not a solution, by all means. There are a lot of bad unions, even ones that aren't racist are bad unions. And there are a lot of really powerless unions. But there's also the way in which it focuses on what is the problem for you. And the problem for you is, I don't get paid enough. The problem for you is, I don't have health care. The problem for you is when I retire, I'm going to be completely flat out on the street. Those are all real problems. It's not like the people you're trying to organize aren't familiar with those problems. And it's not like you have a greater familiarity with them. Again, no offense, you're like a 20-year-old philosophy student. Yeah, so there's a way in which, a world in which we pose the problem is, how do Columbia students organize the working class, is a world in which we failed, you know, right away. That's the problem with the left right away. As Adolph says, that's a world in which it's time for us to move to Brussels. Classic place of exile. Although it was more effective if you were fleeing Napoleon or then Napoleon's successors than it was if you were fleeing Hitler, who got there very quickly.
Well, I have a couple of things to say, and one is, there are two questions, and one is how you communicate the sort of things I was trying to communicate in my lecture. And I think you can do that to all sorts of audiences. And as I tried to suggest earlier, one of the tactics you need to use is to get the high-flown stuff out of your presentation. Use concrete nouns and active verbs. Don't talk about racialization, for example. My students all know that they've just failed the test if they use that word around me. So that's part of the answer. If what you want to do is convince people that even though they see the sun travel across the sky from the east to the west, nevertheless, the sun doesn't travel around the earth, it's the other way around. And there's a way you can tell people that. And you cannot say your eyes don't show you that the sun travels around the earth. Every day they will show you that the sun travels around the earth. And you have a job, if that's your kind of teaching, to make clear what the relationship is between the illusion and the reality. That's one problem. It's a different problem, not an unrelated problem, but it's a different problem, how you actually set about organizing. And I have two things to say about that, and one of them is that it was very instructive to listen to the organizers of the Amazon Union talk about the lengthy process that went into their eventually successful campaign. And it had to do with meeting after meeting after meeting in which people discussed, what do we want in this workplace? What is wrong with this workplace? What do we want? Not who voted for Trump and who voted for somebody else. None of the other stuff, not about whose pronoun is which, just about what do we want out of this workplace. That doesn't mean the other things aren't important. It just means that you have to tackle things in order, and you have to tackle things at the level where you can tackle them most effectively. And as Adolph just emphasized, you go for what will give you the necessary number of supporters. You don't look to find the ways that cut you off from everybody else. You look to find the ways that generalize. And in the talk that Adolph mentioned earlier today, I mentioned a book by Barrington Moore, many years in the 1970s, that was called Reflections on the Causes of Human Misery and on Certain Proposals to Eliminate Them. And one of the points he made very early on in the book is that if you ask people what will make them happy, the answers are so various that it doesn't give you anything you can work with. But if you ask what makes people miserable, it's the same things. We all do not want the same things to happen to us. We don't want to be tortured. We don't want to starve. We don't want to be impoverished to the point where we can, and so on. And starting from there actually gives you a way to talk to other people and make a broader coalition than just me, myself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I actually just want to really second that because, so we were involved, a bunch of us, in organizing a union, faculty union at UIC about 15 years ago. And, organizing faculty for a union, it's horrible. And I'm not the ideal person to do it. If the one thing united my entire faculty, part of that was that their commitment to diversity, and I just published a book called The Trouble with Diversity. So if you're going to go in and have a political conversation, like who did you vote for, how do you feel about diversity, I was going to sign up like nobody, basically. And they were all going to say, don't join the union, Walter's part of it. So the question was exactly what Barbara said. When we were being trained to do this, we were being trained, first question were, what do you like about your job? What don't you like about your job? And when you started talking about that, you got answers. And it's not that you got really great original answers. In our line of work, if you're an academic, you're paid for originality. Nobody had original answers. We all actually hated the same things about the jobs, and we all sort of liked the same things. There was a little leeway back and forth. And no one cared who voted for whom. Now, that doesn't mean it wasn't going to matter at a certain point. But then when we got organized, it took us 2 years and a strike to get just to the contract. But when we got to the contract, what people like to do in organizing is they like to reach agreement on the easy issues first. So we're sitting across the table from people. It's going to take us years to actually reach some agreement on autonomy in teaching, and we lost a lot of those issues, to reach some agreement on money. We had a little more success, to reach agreement on the hardest issues, adjunct stuff, where we had a lot of success. All right? But what was the first thing they said? What was the easy one to sign off on? The first two were the easy ones to sign off on were the diversity commitment and the sort of a kind of subsidiary of that, a kind of version of a civil rights equipment. Why? Because you're sitting across during the Obama years. It's a whole bunch of people on one side who voted for Obama enthusiastically, a whole bunch of people on the other side who voted for Obama enthusiastically, and me who voted for Obama because Adolph said, yeah, it's better than the alternative, and it was better than the alternative, okay? So that's what it is. On that level, we all kind of agree. And when it comes to diversity, we all agreed. No one was against the idea that we should have more people of color in the university. No one was against the idea. But when it came to the actual issues in the workforce, not only did we not agree, we fought for 2.5 years over that. That lets you know which side you're on, right? Whereas talking to them about politics does not let you know which side you're on. Whole politics is geared to letting. So we're not all, I would say, going back to the Columbia thing, you're an undergraduate, you can't do it. Become a graduate student in philosophy. There are no jobs. Your parents will not be happy. Your future professionally will suck, but you can join the Graduate Students Union. The only progressive thing any graduate student has ever done as a graduate student in an American university is join the Graduate Student Union. That gets you closer to what the actual issues are than, you can read whatever. I'm just trying to, all the names that come to mind, what's going to sound insulting, so I'm not going to say any of the names. See, Eric, I've gotten a little more discreet in my old age. But the point being, I don't care who you read. Nothing you read and nothing you teach to Columbia undergraduates is going to have any kind of radical potential at all. But you're going to the union meeting, going to the union hall with the union maid and the union boys and joining up and finding how that works. That's the beginning of an actual politics. Now, probably too late, but still, to me, that actually speaks to not the policy question in itself, but speaks to where the policy answers begin to come from on an organizing level. So again, not everybody can do it. You don't have a job, you can't do it. At a place like Columbia, it's illegal for the faculty to unionize. Best thing that ever happened to me was leaving Johns Hopkins University, a very wealthy university where you couldn't unionized by law, and going to UIC, a flat broke university, but where actually there was no law forbidding you to unionize, and where therefore unions looked like a kind of possible solution. Is it a total solution? No. It's like C- is where we are. But compared to like, the lowest possible F, but feeling really happy about the fact that we teach anti-racist first-year writing classes, having a union is a big upgrade from that, even if your union is like at best just like sucks. But it's not racist. Sorry, the guy's gone.
I'd like to thank the speakers for an invigorating discussion. I want to remind people that signed copies of the book are available for sale here at the table. Still only $25 American, right? We don't take, American dollars. Unfortunately, I know a few more people have questions, but we're running out of time because the venue has to close in about 10-15 minutes. So I want to thank everyone for coming out on a rainy day, and hopefully we'll have more events in the future.
Dice mi madre que enero está regalado, que se me acerca pa' sombra y que no los quiere a mi lado, que soy hija de la suerte, que lo mío es natural, que no reparta mi gloria pa' que no me quiera mal. Dice mi madre, tu ocha no es avalado, pero si fueras un hombre tambor fuera consagrado. Moyupa Egun, que no te deja caer, que va a la guerra contigo para que puedas vencer. Dice mi madre será fina y del ballet, pero la conga contigo jalándote pa'l bembé, que te regala la risa y un tumbao que tumba, y que por eso los muertos te van a jalar pa' la rumba. Soy bonco, la rumba me llamo yo, la rumba me llamo